They say isolation breaks a man, but what if isolation was your only lifeline? What if your shield against death wasn't armor but wool, moss and dung? And what if, to survive winter, you had to lie beneath a blanket of breathing, bleating bodies just to see the dawn? Up in the wind-battered highlands of old Norlandia, where frost gnaws at bones and the air itself howls like a ghost, trudged a solitary figure. Wrapped in layers of ragged flax and sheep hide, he moved with quiet resolve, trailing his flock like a shadow of their woolly god. His name? Bram Larkwood, a herdsman, yes, but not one from a storybook. His life wasn't poetic, it was primal, relentless, a slow duel with nature where the loser vanished beneath the snow. While villagers huddled near hearths and cursed the bitter season, Bram roamed the bleached, biting wilderness with no roof, no walls, and no promise of mercy. If the peasants in their timber homes felt the sting of winter, Bram lived inside its throat. His home was a patchwork hovel jammed into the earth like a wartime trench. Its walls? Stacked turf, cracked stones, sticks, whatever the land coughed up. Roofed with sod and woven bramble, it looked more like a forgotten hill than a dwelling. And perhaps that was the point. He didn't need a house. He needed a hiding place from death. Inside, it was less a room than a burrow. The floor was raw dirt covered in dead ferns and old heather. A nook for a fire, barely bigger than a child's cradle, smouldered with peat smoke that clung to your lungs like regret. His bed was a curled nest of twigs, topped with greasy sheepskin. The only furniture was survival. On nights when the cold gnawed bone, newborn lambs shared his den, breathing warmth into the damp air. In that smoke-choked darkness, the outside world melted away. Wind turned into a muffled memory. The hut didn't just shelter Bram's body, it shielded his sanity. What made it genius was its throwaway nature. No architects, no blueprints. Bram could throw one together in days, anywhere his flock grazed. Come spring, it was abandoned, left to rot and return to soil. In months, only a faint mound remained, a whisper of shelter, a fossil of endurance. But in truth, Bram's strongest refuge had a heartbeat. Hundreds, actually. His sheep weren't just inventory, they were insulation. In the harshest times, they became his battalion against the freeze. Their wool, saturated with thick lanolin, was practically armor, but even they feared the shrieking wind. So Bram built them a fortin enclosure of rock, branch, and turf tucked in valleys or behind forested ridges, always out of the wind's throat. Inside that sheepfold, the animals crammed together, shoulder to shoulder, flank to flank, a living furnace, a woolly engine of heat. So dense was their huddle, the core of the mass steamed like a soup pot in the morning frost, and Bram? He'd lie behind this beastly barricade, his back pressed to their warm flanks, wrapped in breath and muffled bleats. The smell, pungent, earthy, raw, wasn't unpleasant. It was life. It was a scent you'd follow through darkness. But this closeness came with danger. The flock was a trembling orchestra. At night, Bram tuned into every note, the soft chewing, gentle snores, the quiet murmur of contentment. Any shift? A startled cry, a snap of panic, and he'd be up like a lightning bolt. He spoke their language, not with words, but intuition. Yet, if one wolf howled or a branch cracked wrong, the herd could explode into chaos. Hundreds of panicked bodies stampeding in the dark didn't differentiate between friend and foe. Bram had to sleep with one ear open and one hand on his crook. Disease also lurked. A single cough from the wrong sheep could spread hoof rot or pox like wildfire. In those cramped pens, contagion meant more than dead livestock, it meant doom. And yet even the filth helped. The bedding layers of dung, straw, and time-generated warmth as it decayed. Bram and his mangy dog often curled up in this compost bed, snoring beside their source of food, fuel, and survival. But the sheep weren't his only fire. Beneath a canopy of fog, inside that sodden den, one more lifeline crackled. The hearth. To Bram, fire wasn't ambiance, was strategy. He didn't have the luxury of stock firewood. Everything that burned, he had to find or steal from the landscape's clenched hand. What he used might disgust the gentry: dried moss, peat bricks, withered grass twisted into ropes, sometimes even sun-dried animal droppings. He wasn't picky if it smoldered, it stayed. That fire roasted roots, dried wool, thawed boots, and reminded him that light still existed in the world. But none of this was glamour. It was war. A slow, grinding campaign waged daily with death itself. Bram wasn't a quaint hill shepherd. He was a survivalist. An engineer of warmth, a listener of livestock, a magician of the mundane. So next time you see a windswept hill and imagine a gentle shepherd whistling to his dog, think again. Think of Bram. Think of a man sleeping in smoke and dung, hugging a wall of animals like a soldier behind enemy lines. And think of what it takes to survive a winter when the only thing between you and death is fleece, flame, and faith. Starting a fire in the middle of nowhere sounds easy until the wind starts screaming, the ground turns to ice, and your only dry tinder smells like yesterday's breakfast. Would you still survive? Or would winter turn you into a silent statue in the snow? To ignite warmth on the white, deathly sprawl of Norlandia's highlands was not just survival, it was craftsmanship. Flint, charcloth, and dried fungus were as precious to Bram Larkwood as bread. He always kept them in a small pouch, right next to a crude metal cross. His mother gave him a reminder that sometimes even fire needed a prayer. Lighting a spark under icy wind was like performing surgery during an earthquake. But Bram? He could pull flame out of a damp rock if you gave him 5 minutes and a bad attitude. The trick wasn't just in lighting it, it was in knowing where fire hid in the bones of the land. He searched for kindling beneath tree roots, inside rotted stumps, under rocky ledges where the rain couldn't reach. It was treasure hunting with frostbitten fingers. And when he finally got a flame dancing, it was never a bonfire, it was a carefully crafted glow, just big enough to warm his hands and toast a strip of rabbit meat if he was lucky. No flamboyant flickers, no wasted heat, just controlled energy tucked in a stone cradle or dug into the earth like a buried ember. Sometimes he'd crouch behind a boulder and let its curved back reflect the heat right into his face, as if the land itself was sharing its breath. Wood was rare in the windswept moors where his sheep grazed. Forests were distant luxuries. So Bram turned to what was all around: himdry gorse, thornbrush, peat, and the king of forgotten fuels, sheep droppings. All summer, he collected and dried these brown briquettes, storing them like gold. In winter, they burned slow, hot, and with a smoke that didn't give away your position. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. His fuel cycle was genius. His sheep fed him, clothed him, warmed him, and then kept him warm again after digestion. But the real skill? Keeping the fire alive through the night. Bram didn't let flames devour his fuel. Before crawling into his scratchy blanket nest, he buried the coals under a mound of ash, cutting off their oxygen, lulling them into a slow, smouldering sleep. In the morning, he'd brush them clean, blow softly, and coax them back to life without wasting a spark or his patience. It wasn't fire, it was a ritual. His son in the dirt. A flickering soul that sang to him in the dark and kept his fears quiet. Every fuel had its voice. Peat crackled like tired laughter. Dried sheep droppings whispered as they burned. Some smoke stung the eyes. Others smelled oddly comforting like roasted soil. But all of it drove away what mattered most: the silence, the wolves, the thoughts. That tiny hearth became a miniature universe in a black void. Outside the circle of firelight, the world could vanish. But in its glow, Bram had warmth, safety, and purpose. It wasn't just heat, it was sanity. And to keep that fire lit inside him, Bram wore the best armor nature had ever invented: wool. For someone living under the open sky, clothes weren't accessories, they were architecture. His cloak was no fashion statement. It was a thick, hooded wrap called a bralin, handspun from unwashed wool, still slick with lanolin. That greasy, sticky fat made it waterproof without any fancy tools. Rain and snow rolled right off, like guilty lies. His cloak turned him into a walking tent. The hood? It didn't just keep his head dry. It made a personal bubble of warmth around his nose and mouth, so every breath didn't freeze his lungs. Underneath, Bram layered like a master: linen shirt, wool tunic, another thicker wool tunic, and scratchy breeches. His legs were wrapped tight with strips of wool. His feet and hands, the front lines of frostbite, were coddled like royalty. Thick mittens, heavy socks, boots reinforced with hide and grease. He'd stuff straw inside the shoes not just for padding, but to wick away sweat and prevent fungus. Every night he dried that straw by the fire, knowing that neglecting his toes could cost him his life. The clothes stank. Let's be honest, the smelled like a damp fireplace had wrestled a sheep and lost. But they worked. His woolen shell held his body heat like a furnace, even while snow piled on top of him. On a blizzardy night, Bram could sleep in a pit dug into a drift, wrapped in that oily cloak, and wake up alive. And when he sat for hours watching his herd, he used his staff like a tent pole. He'd plant it in the ground, drape his cloak over it, and crouch inside a one-man teepee, snug against the wind. A wizard in wool. A bearded burrito. Even color mattered. His garments were the color of dirt and stone grey, brown, mossy green, so he blended into the hills like a shadow. No wolf, thief, or tax collector would spot him easily. His clothes weren't stitched in shops, they were born on his land. He sheared the sheep. His wifer, sometimes Hespen the yarn, wove the cloth and shaped it by hand. Every seam held memory. Every thread a story. These weren't garments. They were lineage. But Bram's greatest tool wasn't wool or flame or dung. It was his eyes, his ears, his gut. Because to survive out there, you had to know when the wind was about to shift, when snow would fall, when the land whispered secrets in bird calls or clouds, or the silence before the storm. Survival was not just in the muscle, it was in the mind. What if you could read the land like a language? Not maps, not signs, but the bend of a tree branch, the hush of birds, or the taste of the air. For Bram Larkwood, that wasn't fantasy. It was survival, and ignorance meant death. Bram's brilliance didn't end at firecraft or wool-based wizardry. His truest weapon was the way he knew the world around him. Where others saw lifeless hills and tangled shrubs, Bram saw code information. Clues, whispers. Every valley, every gnarled root, every crooked boulder was part of a living manuscript he had spent his entire life learning to read. And in that script lay everything he needed to stay alive. He knew where the wind died and where it roared. He could smell a storm 2 hours before the sky changed, just by the way crows circled or how the trees fell suddenly silent. The way a squirrel moved, the way frost bit into the bark, these weren't random events. They were warnings, cues, and he obeyed them like scripture. When he spotted snow clouds stacking along the northern ridge, he didn't panish, moved. Quick, precise, like someone who'd played this game before. Because he had, so had his father. And his grandfather. This knowledge was ancestral, whispered from old mouths to young ears over generations of frostbitten memory. The spots Bram chose for winter pasture weren't random either. He guided his sheep to the southern hillsides where the sun stayed longer and shadows came slower. There, the earth drained water cleanly, avoiding the death trap of soggy, freezing ground. His pens weren't just fences, they were fortresses. He used fallen logs, thick hedges, and cliffs as natural barricades, layering man-made solutions on top of nature's foundation. It wasn't resistance, it was collaboration. He didn't conquer the land like a lord behind stone wall, she folded himself into it. The hills were his fort, the trees, his sentries, the cliffs, his roof. Bram didn't impose his will on the landscape, he vanished into it, and that made him invisible to storms and to predators. This subtle art, this vanishing act, was his real genius. It wasn't just survival, it was symbiosis. He belonged to the earth as much as the earth belonged to him. But even the best wilderness whisperer couldn't endure without one thing: companionship. And for Bram, that came on 4 legs, with sharp ears and eyes that never blinked in a storm. His dog, a scruffy black mutt named Marn, was more than company. She was Bram's second brain, second heart, and backup soul. Together they roamed like 2 halves of the same mind. Marn wasn't a pampered pet, she was a sentinel, a herder, a rescuer. She could chase a straying lamb from a mile off, outrun a wolf, and bark only when it mattered. One good dog like Marn was worth 10 hired hands and didn't complain about rations. When blizzards turned the world into a white oblivion, Marn used her nose and instinct to find lost sheep or danger on the wind. She was Bram's radar, alarm, and sometimes even his conscience. At night, she curled beside him, either at the flap of his turf hut or pressed against his spine, stealing his heat and giving it right back. That damp, warm, smelly ball of fur was more than comfort. She was his lifeline. They talked well, Bram did, about weather, about death, about the absurdity of trying to protect dumb animals from a world that hated softness. Marn didn't reply, of course, but she listened better than any man ever could. And in that silent communion, Bram found something rare: sanity. She was his world, and if anything ever happened to her, if a wolf's teeth found her or the cold silenced her, Bram would be as good as blind, deaf, and naked. That's how strong their bond was. But there was no time to wax poetic, because as winter turned its last pages and the frost began to soften, Bram entered the most terrifying chapter of all: lambing season. Forget poetry. Lambing wasn't beautiful. It was chaos, wrapped in cold and blood and cries. The moment the sun tilted towards spring, the ewes began birthing the next generation. And Bram? He became a midwife, surgeon, babysitter, and priest all in one. Sleep became a luxury. For days, sometimes weeks, she walked in circles around his pen, checking sheep, helping mothers who struggled, pulling new life into this brutal world with hands hardened by frost but soft with intent. The worst part? The timing. Spring didn't come gently. One day a thaw, the next a snap freeze. Rain, then sleet, then a blizzard at dawn. The newborns to knee, wet, defenseless, were as fragile as breath. If left too long in the open air, they froze into statues of what could have been. So Bram rushed them into his hut, wrapping them in cloth, cradling them near the fire like sacred relics. Sometimes he even breathed warm air into their mouths, coaxing life from the void. He fed them by hand, using a carved horn filled with goat milk or ewe's leftovers. His dark little burrow turned into an emergency ward smoke, bleats, firelight, and trembling lambs. Some lived, some didn't, and everyone that died took a chunk of Bram's soul with it. Because this wasn't just about saving sheep, it was his future, his food, his livelihood. Each lamb lost was money burned, hope extinguished. But every tiny survivor that stood on wobbly legs and squeaked its first cry, that was a miracle, a win against the odds. And through it, every cold breath, every heartbeat, every scraped knee in the dark man was there, watching, barking when needed, curling beside dying lambs as if lending them her warmth too. Follow or subscribe the channel to join Bram. He didn't wear a crown, he didn't hold a sword, but there, in the flickering light of a dung-fed fire, cradling a shivering newborn in cracked hands, Bram Larkwood was the king of survival. And that tiny lamb? His fragile kingdom. That image of a ragged man shielding a life no bigger than a satchel, flames licking shadows across the stone walls of his burrowis, perhaps the most haunting portrait of shepherd life. It wasn't romantic, it was raw, pure. A silent vow between man and beast that survival, no matter how cruel, would never be a solo act. Keeping that fire alive meant feeding it the oddest treasures. Bram's meals were just as Humbleno feasts, no stews bubbling in clay pots. His food had to be tough, durable, and as patient as he was. Days away from the village meant everything he needed had to fit in a satchel that smelled like old cheese and hope. His bread? Not the soft golden loaf of poetry. It was a dense, brick-like cake of barley, or rye-hard enough to survive frost, rain, or a sheep stepping on it. He could chew it straight or soften it with water or whatever warm liquid he had. Cheese came next. Salty, firm, sheep's cheese he made himself aged to outlast the wind. With that and the bread, he could trick his body into thinking it had eaten something worth remembering. If luck was on his side, Bram had a sliver of cured meat or lard tucked in waxed cloth, but those were rare and hoarded like treasure. Most of the time, he scraped together barley grits and wild garlic into a thin porridge stirred over his low, smokeless fire. He might toss in dried berries from last summer if his fingers hadn't fumbled them into the snow. And don't even mention drinks. Water from a cold stream was luxury. Ale or cider, only on feast days, and Bram hadn't seen one in years. But it worked. His Spartan diet matched his mission. Light, calorie, dense, and built for long hauls. It made him as mobile as his sheep and as durable as the peat bricks that fueled his fire. Speaking of fuel, few things demanded as much ingenuity as keeping a fire alive on a treeless ridge. Unlike villagers who could sneak into the woods for firewood, Bram had to outwit the landscape. Where others saw weeds and waste, he saw fuel. Dry heather, thorny gorse, even twisted roots became kindling when the wind wasn't watching. In summer, he carved peat from marshes and let it harden in the sun into slow-burning bricks. He stored them like treasure, stacked behind his hut like a dragon hoarding heat. And then came the true shepherd's magic, the sheep dung. What others might avoid, Bram treasured. Dried in the summer sun and stored in tidy piles, these unassuming brown discs burned hot, clean, and quiet. They were the gift that kept giving wool, milk, warmth, and fire. His herd wasn't just sustenance, it was infrastructure. It was an entire ecosystem in motion. Nothing went to waste. Everything had a role. But no tool, no fire, no food could truly protect Bram from the one enemy that stalked silently, every minute of every day, solitude. More crushing than frostbite, louder than the howling wind, loneliness was the slow poison that tested every man's mind. Weeks, sometimes months, no other voice, no friendly touch. Just the creak of his knees, the sigh of wind through stones, the constant bleating of his herd. Marn, his faithful dog, was the only familiar heartbeat. She was more than a workmate, she was a tether to sanity. They shared food, body heat, silence. Her eyes, bright with loyalty, said things no words ever could. In her gaze, Bram found agreement, concern, understanding. She was family, confidant, guardian. That unspoken bond became his anchor. Alone in the wilderness, surrounded by breathless skies and indifferent hills, Bram found solace in the smallest exchanges, a paw twitching near his leg, a low growl at night, the soft sigh of her sleep. In that silence, Bram's mind flourished. He sang songs only the wind heard, recounted tales his grandfather mumbled when the fire was low, whispered prayers into the night sky, not asking for rescue but for resilience. He wasn't losing his mind, he was shaping it, sharpening it. He noticed things others couldn't, the way frost formed first on certain rocks, how the crows circled oddly when a storm brewed. His senses became honed like a blade in solitude. He wasn't retreating from the world, he was becoming part of it. Solitude didn't crush him, it carved him, turned him into something more. But that same isolation was his greatest risk. A twisted ankle, a sudden fever, a wolf's fang or a flock gone missing. With no one to run to, even a small mistake could become a grave. So Bram was methodical, focused, he moved with caution. He planned for what others didn't dare imagine. Every step was a calculation, every choice, a life or death gamble. Because he had no backup, just his instincts and man. In the end, what made Bram invincible wasn't muscle, gear, or food. It was something far quieter, the mind of a man who'd turned every hardship into ritual, who'd embraced nature not as an enemy but as a tutor. He built shelters from hill and turf, wrapped himself in grease-soaked wool, burned dung with pride, ate roots and crusts with quiet gratitude, but most of all he endured. And in that endurance, he revealed a truth. Survival isn't about tools or tricks. It's about knowing what matters, about listening to the land, about finding warmth when no one else would look. Bram Larkwood's tale isn't one of grandeur. It's not etched in stone or sung in taverns, but it should be. Because in the bitter breath of winter, he showed what it truly means to live when everything tells you to give up. Follow or subscribe the channel if you want to uncover more stories like this raw, real, and long forgotten.